Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this lecture by the new holder of the Roger Howell Jr. Professorship of History, David Gordon. Before I introduce Professor Gordon, I want to tell you a little bit about the Howell Professorship. This endowed chair was established by the Board of Trustees in 2000 in memory of Roger Howell Jr., Bowdoin's 10th president. President Howell was a remarkable leader who was a brilliant student at Bowdoin, graduating in the class of 1958 as a Rhodes Scholar and an accomplished historian and history professor here at the college. He became president in 1969 at the age of 32 and led the, no pressure there, and led the college for 13 years. You can read more about President Howell's illustrious career in the program. Reading about Roger Howell in preparation for this occasion, it was clear to me that our shared devotion to teaching would have been common ground for us. Celebrating a faculty member for their teaching and scholarship is an important and joyful moment, and I am truly thrilled to be introducing our speaker and honoree. Our speaker tonight is David Gordon, who's only the second Roger Howell Jr. professor. The chair, previously held by Professor of History Alan Wells, who retired in 2018. Professor Gordon arrived at Bowdoin in 2005 and was quickly embraced by his students and his colleagues for his extraordinary degree of thoughtfulness, care, and creativity with which he approached his teaching, his research, and his service to the academic community. And I heard a little bit about this from his students this evening. Professor Gordon's scholarly work focuses on the history of Southern and Central Africa over the last 2 centuries. He approaches topics from novel points of view using richly valuable, but often underused sources and imaginative entry points into complex questions. His first book, for example, traced the history of fishing in Zambia and the Democratic Republic of Congo as a way of understanding changes to those nations' economies and social and natural environments. His most recent book, Invisible Agents, examines how spiritual beliefs have inspired social change in Central Africa. And he currently is studying the art and oral traditions of the region to explore its political changes in the 19th century. A South African native, Professor Gordon also teaches and researches extensively about apartheid, and his compelling work in this area has inspired several of his students to pursue honors projects on topics such as memory, the queer experience, and liberal journalism in apartheid and post-apartheid era South Africa. Professor Gordon is a leader in his field as a member of the African Studies Association, Central African Studies Association, Zambian Network for Historical Research, and a founding member of the Zambezi African Studies Association. He is currently a member of the advisory editorial board for the Journal of African History and is former reviews editor of Chronos, South African Histories. Professor Gordon received his BA with distinction in economic history and first-class honors in African history from the University of Cape Town, South Africa, as well as a master's and PhD in history from Princeton University. He is the recipient of a National Endowment for the Humanities Award and a Humanities Research Center Fellowship at Rice University, among others. And his first book, Nachichuti's Gift, was a finalist for the Melville J. Herskovits Award for Best Book in African Studies. A thoughtful and collaborative colleague, an inspiring mentor, and a deeply original scholar, Professor Gordon is a treasured member of our faculty and a deserving holder of this endowed chair. Please help me welcome and congratulate the Roger Howell Jr. Professor of History, David Gordon.
Thank you. First comes gratitude, and especially to Leslie, my wife, and to my children, Oliver, who's here today, and Samara, who's not, for our journeys of discovery together, to my in-laws, Natalie and Mike, who have made this place home, to my South African family who are far away but who gave me an adolescence of rigorous debate, and to my Bowdoin community. My history department colleagues and other Bowdoin faculty, and especially my students, have inspired my intellectual journey here at Bowdoin. President Zaki, for joining us here at Bowdoin. I don't know where you got to. There you are. And for Dean Jen Scanlon for her leadership and advocacy on behalf of faculty and students here at Bowdoin. But today it seems most appropriate to thank Roger Howell, Jr., after whom my endowed chair is named. I was thrilled to receive this endowed chair, in part because the previous holder was Alan Wells, who recruited me and was always a mentor and inspiration for me. Alan cannot make it tonight due to his own work obligations, which continue after a retirement. A life of research never ends. But I'd like to thank him for even in his absence, he inspires me, and Kathy is here after all, so thank you for coming. Now, like Alan, I have also been joined to the name of President and Professor Roger Howell. In Central Africa, when you inherit a title, you are said to inherit many of the qualities of your predecessor. This system of succession of titles is meant to ensure that we appreciate the best qualities of our ancestors and emulate them in our official capacities. Roger Howell was a fine historian of the English 17th century, composing several influential books, the first being what a reviewer describes as a beautifully documented piece of research that situated at the changing alliances of a royalist northern English town during the Puritan Revolution. Professor Howell became interested in the most controversial figure of that period, and probably of British history, Oliver Cromwell, an eager signatory to regicide and a leader in a violent time that led Britain on the path to liberalism, imperialism, and capitalism. Professor Howell served as president of Bowdoin College from 1969 to 1978, a time that witnessed profound changes at Bowdoin, including the founding of Afrikaner Studies and Environmental Studies, and the admission of women into the college. He returned after his service as president to historical research. At the time of his untimely death, at the very young age of 53, my age right now, he was investigating the creation of historical myths around Oliver Cromwell. In fact, as I read more of the work of Professor Howell, I felt a greater affinity, so much so that I want to say a few words to him directly, to encourage the spirit of Professor Howell to stir and consider once again his final intellectual project, how we write about the mythic heroes of others. I hope that the debate I offer here will be sufficiently enticing for a brief return to your beloved college, Professor Howell. Today, I will discuss the mythologizing of a historical figure who was said to have existed at the same time as Cromwell. But the empire my hero founded ended in part because of that which the followers of Cromwell created. I'm not sure if Professor Howell, if my Central African historical hero, holds any interest or relevance to you. But since I'm in some way the successor to your name, I ask you to listen to the story of another hero that might appear a little exotic. But I suspect you, Professor Howell, are appreciative of other histories, for even as my historical hero is not as familiar as Oliver Cromwell, you are not unfamiliar with the desire to travel and research of history as discovery and adventure. From your beginnings in Baltimore, Maryland, you went to faraway Bowdoin and then across the Atlantic on a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford, where you, too, were treated as a foreigner. You overheard your PhD advisor say, Howell, he is American, but he is sound. Thanks, Professor Dan Levine, for that anecdote. I have no idea of what inspired you as the young man photographed here to embark on this journey, but in what follows, I'll describe what inspired me to research and tell the history of others, and how we should tell those histories. Why do we tell the histories of others? To whom does history belong? What are the moral and ethical implications of telling the history of others from the privileged position of a US college campus? History as a discipline and as a practice generally began by telling stories of the self, of one's own society, in part as it encountered other societies. The modern discipline of anthropology, by contrast, focused on the foreign, the other. Over the last few decades, anthropologists have spilled much ink on self-critical studies of what it means to discuss other cultures, and partly as a consequence, they have begun studying themselves. During the same period, in a somewhat reverse move to their anthropologist colleagues, historians have embraced the study of other histories, but sometimes without the critical reflections that have characterized contemporary anthropology. My talk today is a reflection on the ethics and consequences for history as a discipline of this turn to the study of others. As a historian of Africa, my scholarship and my teaching has often been about others, but in studying others, I have also studied myself. Through telling and reflecting history, I have reflected on who I am, on the communities that I belong to, and the power historians wield when we research and tell histories. So over the next 30 minutes, I will offer a reflection on my personal journey as a historian, describing several of my research projects over the past 2 decades, and some of the lines connecting them. By doing so, I'll describe how other histories have also become my history. But I also hope to show how certain innovations in Central African history telling in the 19th century offer guidance to contemporary historians concerning studying other histories. In Central Africa, certain ideas and ways of telling history acted to unify different histories, making a universal history in which diverse peoples viewed their identities reflected. This talk reflects on the creation of a universal history through a legendary hero, the hunting man, Chibinde Lunga, whose history attempted to unify Central Africans. But before we think of others, I want to reflect on who we are. We are never whole beings that can be represented by single identities. Identities are fluid. We are existentially fractured by our social positions, our families, our neighborhoods, our institutions, our ancestral memories, and perhaps most importantly, our journeys through space and time. I'm a professor at Bowdoin College, a longtime resident of Maine, a white male American married to a Marylander who moved to Maine, now a father of 2 Mainer children. But I grew up as a white male South African, a Jew whose grandparents and great-grandparents fled the German Holocaust and the European pogroms. My family's history is that of refugee and colonial settler. Like many other colonial settlers, we became settlers because we were refugees. We are products of migratory flows and structural forces that willy-nilly define who we are. But we have agency. We mobilize elements of our identities unevenly and to strategic and emotional ends. This uneven mobilization of identity in contexts that we are often uncomfortable fractures our sense of self. I've come to understand that it's out of this sense of fractured identity that we begin to tell history. It's a process of self-discovery in the face of the traumas and also the joys of existence, to solidify who we are, who we think we are, who we want to be, and what we want the world to be. Like many young historians from South Africa in the 1980s, I was drawn to history because it helped articulate our opposition to apartheid. History told of the imposition of political and economic oppression, and it allowed redemption from oppression through heroic narratives of resistance. Fighting apartheid, an institutionalized form of oppression, of discrimination based on perceived and imposed difference, left many South Africans like myself devoted to trying to appreciate the unity behind all people. Yet the search and desire for unity often led us to ignore or downplay difference. We tried to use history to cement together our fractured society and to transform it into something better. As apartheid ended, I felt an urge to leave South Africa at the age of 24, just finishing my first degree. I was not sure whether I belonged to South Africa. I had struggled there for equal rights. I loved it and its history, but what claim, as the family of recent settler ancestry, could I have on it? I wanted to leave to discover the world and hence discover myself. In the struggle against apartheid, I was fervently South African, but the end of apartheid brought about a crisis in my political and academic engagements. I can remember reflecting, only through travel, only by being away will I understand to what extent I am South African. I think that's really why I came to the US to study African history. And in the US, I no longer wanted to study South Africa. I turned to Central Africa. For this, like the US, was certainly not where I was from. This was an existential process of discovery and self-discovery. I wanted to know where I belonged. At the same time, I was aware of the issues regarding the representation of others. I pored over Edward Said, who in a powerful text, Orientalism, had written about how the representation of others, of the so-called Middle East, by Europeans and Americans was complicit in projects of domination. African history, like the history of the Middle East, often fell under the rubric of an area studies program rather than being a core part of the history discipline. I discovered that African studies as area studies within the US had been created and at the time was still dominated by the liberal arm of US imperialism. There was a strong element of what would come to be called white saviorism in African studies. But as with Middle Eastern studies, there was change. New generations of Africans were settling in the US. They were becoming leading scholars of African studies, complicating its old politics. To a certain extent, I was part of these dynamics. These changes are still ongoing, but I was wary, and I often felt more comfortable as a historian rather than a practitioner of African studies. African studies, more than Middle Eastern studies, was involved in the racial politics of the US, its narratives of oppression and redemption. I was influenced by the writings of those who had joined the study of Africa to that of racial oppression in South Africa and in the US diaspora, including C.L.R. James, Walter Rodney, and probably most familiar to the audience here today, W.E.B. Du Bois. I knew that African studies taught in the US could challenge the knowledge base of US racism. But did this tendency subordinate African history to a US-centric narrative? Was there anything wrong with US-centrism? Here in the US, I came to appreciate that, as it was for me in the aftermath of apartheid, the construction of African studies for US-based scholars was an outcome of the fractured US society that had emerged in the wake of race-based slavery. So it was with this intellectual baggage that I undertook my PhD in a history department in the US and traveled to Central Africa to study its history. I arrived at the border of Zambia and the Democratic Republic of Congo, or the DRC, in a region called the Luapula Valley. Many in Zambia and the DRC thought I was a South African mercenary or a CIA spy, or both. The first war in Congo had ended and the second was about to begin. I spoke to people about their past and present. Like many students in the US, I was interested in British and Belgian colonialism and its aftermath. They told me that history, but the colonial period was not really their history. It was the history of others in their lands. A history of invasion, domination, and occupation of whites, of foreigners. They told me of the old colonial administrators and anthropologists who had preceded me. But they also offered to tell me their histories, a deeper and vaster past that I had missed in the books. Or if I had read about them, I thought these histories less important. I was interested in my history, in other words, in the history of the imposition of European society on Africa, and not really in theirs. Yet here, histories other than those I expected were the most important stories, defining who people were and why people belonged to the land. It was these stories that were told with the greatest enthusiasm. The Luapula River runs through a fertile valley, the Luapula Valley, and is a southern tributary of the vast Congo River. Here a king titled Mwata Kazembe once reigned. He represented an eastern branch of a vast empire or confederation called the Lunda, which covered much of South-Central Africa in the 18th and 19th century. Kazembe had lost much of his sovereignty during colonial times to become a mere colonial chief, but still, when I visited in the 1990s, he held considerable power. From some of the oldest men and women, I heard of how Kazembe acquired that power. It was a story of a woman, a cultural hero, Ngāti-Tuti. Her story did not appear in many published histories, only in passing as a myth rather unimportant. Yet this was the story that the oldest and the most knowledgeable people told. It is how they told their history. The story of Ngāti-Tuti begins with a man, Nkuba. Nkuba had many wives, and among them he loved one greatly. One day he found his nephew, the son of his sister Ngāti-Tuti, with his most beloved wife. In a jealous rage, he killed his nephew, he skinned him, he carefully dried the skin, and he kept it under his mat. One day, while her brother was drunk, Ngāti-Tuti found the skin of her son. Upon finding the skin, she decided to go to Mwata Kazembe, who she knew to be a fierce warrior. When Ngāti-Tuti arrived, she went up to Kazembe and she took her menstruation cloth and threw it in his face. She said, "If you are a man, you will avenge this death of my son. I want you to kill this man, my brother Nkuba." On hearing this, Mwata Kazembe instructed his warriors to find Nkuba and bring him back alive. At first, these warriors couldn't find him, and they were angry, and they started killing people. They killed many people. Eventually, they trapped Nkuba, and since they were angry with him for all the trouble he had put them through, they disregarded their king's instructions and killed him. They decapitated Nkuba, put his head in the boat, and returned to Mwata Kazembe. Ngāti-Tuti wanted to reward Kazembe. She took a basket and filled it with soil, and a water jug and filled it with water. She gave the basket to Kazembe and said, "The land is yours." She gave the water jug and said, "The lake and lagoons and rivers are yours." Mwata Kazembe looked after Ngāti-Tuti. When she died, she was regarded as an aristocrat and buried in the royal graveyard. Upon the burial of a Lunda lord, the procession must stop and pay respect at the grave of Ngāti-Tuti. I would return to the Luapula Valley on the border of Zambia and DRC for several years to hear different versions of Ngāti-Tuti's story. It made an impression. The story of Ngāti-Tuti had come to root my understanding of the history of Luapula, as it did those Luapulan elders who told it to me. So much so that I named my first book after it. My apologies for the difficulty in pronunciation of that title. In Luapula, as I asked people about Ngāti-Tuti, I noticed that some people would tell the story with enthusiasm, and others only a few miles away would tell me that they cannot tell that story even if they know it, because it was not theirs to tell. It belonged to someone else, notably the direct descendants of Ngāti-Tuti, Mwata Kazembe, and the Lunda aristocrats who had killed Nkuba. For the most knowledgeable of Luapula elders, histories belonged to identities. They shunned the idea of a universal history, a history that could be told by all, but that belonged to no one. Histories for them belonged to families who were descendants of the characters who were described in these histories. Even though they knew other histories existed, they thought that they were only comfortable telling their history. This form of history telling gave me much food for thought. Their idea of history, of personal family histories that did not aim to tell a universal history, was fascinating, and I would add somewhat disappointing to the young scholar who wanted to be faithful to forms of history told by his interviewees. After all, I was a foreigner collecting their stories to construct a universal history that could be told to others. My very professional commitment to the academic discipline of history was the antithesis of their commitment to history as a family-told narrative. I had their permission to publish the story, and I convinced myself that these stories were part of an oral cultural heritage that should be shared and thus made part of a universal history. But I was still troubled that I was taking the story and placing it in an entirely different context. Moreover, why should I tell the history of Ngāti-Tuti, and what relevance did it hold for the society in which I lived? I think these are great questions to ask, and I'm glad that the Luapulan elders prompted them. We should be reflective on telling the history of others. We should always ask these questions, and I have often encouraged my students to do so. Most of all, though, to anticipate the conclusion of this lecture, we need to make these stories a little less exotic and more familiar, part of our humanity. And we need to recognize that they were historians who composed them. A few years later, in the early 2000s, I studied another oral tradition, that of a traveling hero, Chiti, who had a love affair with a local woman, Chilumbulu. This is Chilumbulu pictured on the top of this, on the sculpture on the top of the staff. The love affair had tragic consequences, and I won't tell the story here, but only note how Chiti's and Chilumbulu's story combined the stories of many people and thus became sort of particularly convoluted. Chiti's inheritors, though, became known as Chitimukulu, which literally translates as the great tree. He was the founder of a kingdom a few hundred miles to the east of the Kazembe kingdom that I described above. By studying the history of Chitimukulu, the great tree, I came to appreciate how dynastic histories combine the histories of many into singular stories, like branches attached to a single trunk. The relationship between personal or family histories and universal history in my research continued to trouble me. Even though the story of Ngāti and similar heroes appeared personal, told by the descendants of those described, I realized that underpinning these personal histories were general narratives. In dynastic narratives like that of Chitimukulu, the great tree, there were efforts to combine many stories together. Moreover, the personal narratives were often variations of myths, common stories that crossed vast distances. For example, I found the exact same story of Ngāti, but with new names hundreds of miles to the west of where I'd first heard it. There were also a few stories of cultural heroes that were found across almost all of South Central Africa. In particular, there was the story of a founding hero, a wandering hunter, Chibinda Ilunga. Just about all histories linked to prestigious political titles began with a variation of the story of Chibinda Ilunga. Now, Chibinda Ilunga I knew about from reading books from graduate school, notably Jan van Siena's classic Kingdoms of the Savannah. Jan van Siena started as a Belgian anthropologist, taught in the US for a long time, and did much to establish African history in the USA. He was a mentor to Tom Speer, who was almost going to be here tonight, but fell ill at the last minute. And Tom Speer was a mentor to me. The late Professor Van Siena offered 20 pages of single-space commentary on my first book, Ngāti Gift, and I was too afraid to look at it for several days. But it landed up, I think, a better book because of it. In any event, Chibinda Ilunga in Van Siena's text was a linchpin figure, reputed to have been the founder of an empire, a foreigner who, with his hunting skills, created a new civilization, the Lunda Empire. But where did the story emerge? Did it represent a dynastic history that combined many stories like that of Chitimukulu, but on an even greater scale? Unlike the Chitimukulu story, Chibinda Ilunga was told over a vast distance, not at the court center of a single kingdom. I suspected that it had once been a personal history that was then taken up by many individual families to become their story. Why did they take up the story of a common ancestor, Chibinda Ilunga? I didn't know, but this fascinated me, and it became the central question that I dedicated my research to. I could study the many variations of the telling of Chibinda Ilunga's story and had some ambition to do so, but that research program would entail crossing a vast area composed of the countries of the DRC, Zambia, and Angola, almost the size of the eastern United States, but with significantly greater infrastructural challenges, as well as huge language diversity. In addition, both the DRC and Angola were then in a state of war, particularly in the rural areas where I wanted to do research. I also realized that Chibinda Ilunga had been universalized not through Central African history telling, but through that great homogenizer of history, writing, and publication. Van Siena's book had been translated into French and Portuguese, and then seeped into the school textbook history of these countries. It was one thing to research a rather obscure ancestral figure like Ngāti, but the story of Chibinda Ilunga had long been standardized. And if this wasn't enough, war had relocated rural people, the archives and the libraries who told this history had scattered. It would be more than a lifetime's work to find those who could tell this history in a helpful way. So the only way to progress on this research agenda was to examine the first recordings of the Chibinde Ilunga narrative before the colonial and post-colonial versions in publications like Vancina had been disseminated. The best example were in Portuguese explorers' accounts, the most important of which had only just been found in the archives. I set about learning Portuguese to read them. That was 15 years ago. 2 years ago, in 2021-2, I dedicated my sabbatical to exploring the archives in Portugal with my family in tow. Thank you, on this wild research chase. Last year in 2023, thanks to the Roger Howell research funds, I supplemented the research with more archival work in Angola. And now I am at last writing up this universal history of South Central Africa through the figure of the wandering hunter, Chibinde Ilunga. One of the most detailed histories of Chibinde Ilunga recorded in the 19th century is the Lunda love story between Chibinde Ilunga and Princess Luege. It begins with this traveling man, Chibinde Ilunga, arriving at a lake where Princess Luege liked to bathe. Princess Luege invited Ilunga to sit down on the rock next to her. Luege, surrounded by her courtiers, listened to the story of Ilunga, especially his resolution to abandon his kingdom and to travel. She admired his civility. She thought that the best way to retain this beautiful hunter would be to speak to him about hunting. So she turned the conversation to that subject. She said there was a lot of game nearby, but that it was difficult to catch because it did not always fall into the traps placed by her people. If the hunter stayed a few days, he could teach Luege's people how to use the weapons that he employed. Ilunga stayed, and Luege became convinced that this man was sent by her dead father to become his heir. Her advisors agreed. They appreciated the hunter Ilunga and pronounced themselves in favor of Luege's marriage to him. They also feared Luege's brothers, one of whom had a rude and cruel temperament and who threatened to organize a faction to take over the state. So the culmination of the story was Chibinde Ilunga's accession to the power in the name of Luege's future son, the first Lunda emperor. Following the inauguration of the Lunda dynasty by the foreigner Ilunga, the angry and dispossessed brothers of Luege went into exile, founding new kingdoms. I investigated the story of Chibinde Ilunga as best as I could in these archival sources. But there was another form of evidence that changed my understanding of Chibinde Ilunga: carefully sculpted figurines. These were produced by a group of male-led matrilineal families who called themselves Chokwe, which literally translates as those who went into exile. In the oral tradition, Luege's aunt or sister, depending on the version, followed the angry, dispossessed brothers, establishing the Chokwe nation. The Chokwe men were renowned for their hunting and carving skills which went together as they had to repair their weaponry and traps. The best of these hunters took the name of hunter. You were named after what you did, and the name for hunter was Chibinda. That meant hunter in Chokwe. The name for man in Chokwe was Ilung. So Chibinde Ilunga was literally the hunting man. And they sculpted this hunting man in magnificent figurines, a few of which definitively date back to the 19th century, when the oral tradition of Chibinde Ilunga was first recorded and written down. The Central African interior in the 19th century, the time that the Chokwe sculpted these figurines, was in a period of profound change. For about 200 years, the region had engaged with the Atlantic slave trade, contributing to the West Central African ports of Luanda and Benguela, shown here, becoming the single most important export center for African captives on their journey to become slaves in the Americas. But by the second half of the century, there were changes in this global political economy, led by the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade and the slow abolition of slavery in the Americas. Instead, global trade focused on a new commodity, ivory, from the tusks of hunted elephants. And the elephants were from West Central Africa. The Chokwe hunters were almost unmatched in their hunting skills. They killed elephants and harvested ivory. The Chokwe Chibinda hunter became the new hero of this political economy. The Lunda of Luege, of Princess Luege, had long engaged with the slave trade. However, the trade in captives was no longer profitable or key to power. The trade in ivory was. Alliance had to be made with the Chokwe hunters. Chibinde Lunga's marriage to Luege was a representation of this alliance. Chibinde Lunga was a Chokwe hero who had to be joined to the Lunda. The love story of Chibinde Lunga and Luege underpinned an alliance between the Lunda and the Chokwe hunters. By having the Lunda queen fall in love with Chibinde Lunga, a great and expansive Lunda family could be created. I want to just step back for a moment and remind the audience, though, that I'm not as concerned with the history of the Lunda as with the telling of this history. I'm discussing the way the story of Chibinde Lunga was told in the 19th century. So, returning to the theme of the histories of others, Lunda historians placed the foreigner, the traveling Chibinde Lunga, right at the center of the Lunda cultural and historical world, along with Princess Luege. The angry brothers who threatened the state fled. Historians in other states thus told the story of the journey of this wandering hunter, Chibinde Lunga. The story spreads across vast distances. Many groups are thereby brought into the story of. This is how African historians created a universal history of Central Africa. It's a history that tells how we were all one family. We're all children or siblings of Princess Luege, and we accepted foreigners. Chibinde Lunga, we accepted foreigners. Chibinde Lunga even married them to improve our civilization. In the end, the mechanisms of Central African history telling developed a new history that crisscrossed polities and told of the need for unity, that we belong to a single family, and the history of one group can also become the history of another. This was a conscious effort to build a unified human history. This formulation might seem a little contrived, perhaps romanticized, but I think through my research, I think unity and alliance were on the minds of those historians who first told the Lunda love story. In the tumultuous world during the final acts of the slave trade and the impending European invasion and occupation, the need for alliance was key. The alliance failed. Warring factions never united against the Europeans. But the story became all the more acute and poignant for that failure. I also found that the story of Chibinde Lunga, as I've studied and retold it to many audiences, also told my story in a way. After all, I was a wandering man in search of meaning and an adventurer who found love in a foreign land. And like Chibinde Lunga, I was even given a title, the Roger Howell Endowed Chair in History. Perhaps I chose this history to tell because it sort of resonated with my story. But more seriously, as I learn of the intrepid spirit of African migrants who journey across the globe to the US and to Maine and to become our neighbors, our spouses, our citizens, some of them from Angola, the modern nation state of the descendants of Chibinde Lunga, I wonder whether the story of Chibinde Lunga has broader and more significant ramifications for us today. The love story between Chibinde Lunga and Luege once joined diverse Central African peoples across caravan routes. Can we find similar stories that provide examples for the building of global alliances? So what guidance do we get from Central African historians regarding telling the history of others? History emerges from telling about our ancestors, as the historians of Luapula told me in the 1990s. But in response to economic and political change, Central African historians also created histories that reached out to construct broader communities and fictive families. For them, accepting others did not require the assimilation of the other to their history and identity. It meant changing their history and their very identities. Today, in our post-global age, the historian, I think, has failed if they keep on viewing and representing these histories as only belonging to others. Or maybe I should put this in a different way. The historian should not represent the history of others as other. Rather, the historian needs to build alliances and connections between disparate histories. I look forward to a time when there's no history of the other, no European history, African history, Asian history, and all of these fields are, in a sense, the branches of that great Chitimakulu tree. The cosmopolitan world of Central Africa in the 19th century formulated a way of describing the unification of families and their histories through falling in love and marrying foreigners, thus increasing the breadth and depth of identity in the idiom of their key social unit, the family. As it was for those 19th century narrators who composed the Lunda love story between Chibinde Lunga and Luege, the task for the historian today is to weave a history of difference into a diverse fabric that can clothe new identities in the idioms of our social and political units, whatever they are. So, Professor Howell, if I've managed to rouse you at all, my ancestor from whom I acquired this title, I might ask whether Chibinde Lunga, the cosmopolitan hunter, lover, and unifier of families who initiated the Lunda Empire, might at least stand alongside Oliver Cromwell, the Puritan who set England on its road to empire, as an alternative or at least an additional historical hero for our times. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I know this was history. I know that this stretched what you all knew about, and I went into a lot of detail about my current research, but I'm happy to take questions, and questions that move in any direction, whatever I've touched on. Yeah. About Chibinde Lunga. You know, the next book is about the hunter, and especially the objects that are used to recreate history and memory. So it's not just about Chibinde Lunga. There are other figurines and objects that invoke the historical imagination, and that's what I'm working on. But Chibinde Lunga is perhaps the best example. So yeah, I'm told questions are supposed to come to the mic. Yeah.
Thank you, David. That was terrific. I assume you have met some of our new neighbors from Angola. Do they still tell the same stories?
Yeah. The short answer is no. And that makes this work even more important because this is Angolan history. There is a longer answer to this. Well, when I said no, that was in response to the question of whether they still tell these histories, right? I would love to engage with the Angolan community here. In Angola itself, as a consequence of the war, there have been huge disruptions in the areas that would tell this history. It is also the part of Angola that the story comes from, the east of Angola, is one of the most securitized. It's where a lot of diamonds come from. And it's kind of colonized by the elites on the coast. And I was there last summer, and essentially I couldn't move without the police following me and asking. You know? So this is a marginal story in Angola. Having said that, there are Angolan authors, and probably the most famous Angolan author, he's based a historical novel on this story. So it is told in that way, and it has become part of the national history. Another tragedy is that there is no longer any Chibinde Lunga figure in Angola. This one is in Germany, and the other ones from the 19th century are in Portugal and maybe France. And I mean, so clearly that invokes a whole lot of questions about restitution that I'm happy to talk about. Anyway.
Thank you, David. That was fantastic. I know this was a history lecture. I hate to throw an art history pop quiz at you, but could you read that figure for us and tell us how it conveys this story in any way?
Okay. I would love to. The hunter firstly sees things that is invisible. It sees game, or he sees game that is disappearing. So he has these powers of vision, and if you look at the face, you see this almost trance-like appearance that he has, able to see the invisible world that reveals the world of the bush and of game. But in addition to his own vision, he has spiritual guides, if you like, that exist on either side of his crown. You see those little figures. And next to his one foot, he has actually a spiritual guide. You can't see it here, but he's riding a lion, because lions can really track game. So these are the instruments. His feet are huge, and his legs are strong because he's able to move through the bush and grasp things like his rifle, which is in his one hand, and his staff of authority and power, which is in his other. You can't see it on this figure, but around, he has a belt and a cartridge box at the back, and other equipment relating to the hunt as well. He is wise, the beard and the facial covering. He is a man of royalty, of royal significance, and you see the diadem, the sort of crown above him. So those are, I think, some of the key aspects from this figurine, and indeed, yeah, that's the joy of working with art historians, or with art, is that we are encouraged to read works and objects in new ways. So, yeah. Yeah, if you want.
Yeah, I'll first say thank you for giving this lecture. I'll say this to the crowd. Professor David Gordon, or David, was my thesis advisor. Both of my parents grew up in South Africa, and I remember my time studying with you very fondly, so thank you for inviting me. There's another remarkable thing, which is that I think it took me a long time to learn that history is an emotional thing, and it takes experience and travel to really fundamentally understand the impact of the story on our understanding of what's happened in the past. Mm-hmm. And actually, just upstairs, I took Perkinson, your class, and I remember at the time I didn't care much about that class because, well, I'll tell you why, because I hadn't seen any of the art that you had showed us. And so you showed us art from, it was from Spain and France and alternating voussoirs and all that stuff. And it wasn't until I traveled and saw some of that art that I realized that it meant something to me. And so I do want to say thank you for, I think, instilling that in me and a number of other students, the emotional part of an education in history. To the question.
Thank you.
I now have the privilege of working with a lot of Angolan students. And often the question comes up from me to them, what do you know about African history broadly? I discovered about a month ago that most of my students, really all but one of about 30, didn't know who Nelson Mandela was, and they're in 8th grade. And so I'm wondering, when you go so deep in understanding this history, what do you think about the responsibility for students and educators to teach this particular history?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. How to make this history accessible and make it into public history, and especially for the young generation. Angola has one of the youngest populations in the world. And when I was there last year, I went to their ethnographic museum, which used to but doesn't anymore have a Chibindi Lunga. And I thought I'd be in this deserted ethnographic museum. Ethnographic museums don't have a great reputation right now. But in Angola, it was packed with school children, yearning for these histories. The guy I worked with, who's sort of the unpaid worker there, because Angola, on a certain level, is a rich country, but it's also a very poor country, knew the story of Chibindi Lunga very well, actually was from this area. And he had school children coming in, and he would tell this history. He didn't have the object to tell it. So I think, and I think museum work is a great way of making this history public, but I think the young population of Angola, and you can talk about them here or in Angola, and places are not that far apart actually. People are, yearn for this history. It's an important part of their history, of our history, I've tried to argue. So, yeah, I would like to make it more accessible, and I have tried to work with the museum in Angola, actually, in trying to develop programs. It's not as easy said and done as said, and funding is really difficult to come by, as you know, trying to run not the same kind of operation, but a similar one. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, David. Great talk.
Thank you.
I thought it was fantastic. I want to draw it back a little bit more to the cranky side of history. Mm-hmm. So my heart sings when you're thinking about a type of braided history, and I like the metaphor of using a braided river, okay? And the idea of taking diverse stories and finding some sort of common threads between them. My mind gets jumpy at this because I start thinking about the specter of usable histories and usable pasts and histories that are in some ways directing where the river goes than necessarily following the current. And I think you kind of get what I'm getting at here. This is kind of one of the constant challenges. And so I wrestle a lot with this in my own work. And so I guess the question I have is, it's maybe not so much a question, but could you tease out a little bit more about what you're trying to get at the end there with thinking about putting aside the two figures here? And I love the fact how you paired Cromwell. That was great on a lot of levels, also because he's just a complete nut.
And this is Roger Howell's book, actually.
Yeah, no, I noticed that. It's like, and Cromwell never looks so good. He's not, ready to spill blood. But I guess I'm trying to get at the fact that there's, as you well know from your own experience growing up where you did, and also your professional practice, that there are real challenges with writing what are perceived as usable pasts or pasts that seem to unify. That the story, in one sense, can help with questions of really creating identity, solidarity, and others, it can be completely flattening, totalizing, and serve a different type of political project.
Right.
So I'm just kind of wondering if you could tease that out a little bit, because like I said, my heart's with you, my mind is not fully on the bus.
Yeah. The relationship between the past and the present in our telling of history is a conflict and a dilemma for all historians. I tend to, through my own experience, to focus a little bit more on how we tell history. And this experience, to a certain extent, comes from studying history-telling forms in Central Africa, because their history is not something past. The ancestors are with us, and they continue to intervene, and they are inherited, and they're part of us. Our conception and our professional conception of history is the past is dead. It's something out there, and we describe it. So, you know, there's no easy answer to that question, except to say that the stories we choose to tell and how we tell them and the concepts we develop should and need to approach what we want history to do in the present. You know, I don't think there's a real problem if we think about it that way. You know, we're always selecting certain stories, certain emphases, certain concepts, and in our selection of those stories, we are mindful of the present. And if we pretend that we're not mindful of the present, I think the historian is lying to themselves. You know, so I suppose that's my yeah.
Can I have a quick follow-up? I get the whole idea. I mean,
Yeah.
I hear a little bit of like a kinder, gentler version of Hayden White stalking around here, okay, and a little bit of this. But I also, the other question is there a danger also in presuming that we can fully understand or easily transport methods of telling histories that may not fit into what still, for better or worse, is the Ronchian tradition of kind of like the past is back there and we're going to look at it in the subjective, Germanic, university-driven way? Because I would say that I'm all with you, and I think that, you know, in my own sort of stuff I know better, indigenous historians in North America, both people that work with indigenous communities and also people identify as indigenous, have done a lot to think about this question of storytelling, but there's also a lot of tensions around identity and appropriation with method that there's a politics there too.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I would like to have talked about that politics a little more, but I'm just going to answer that question by saying, to me, the most important first step is recognizing other modes of history telling as history telling, recognizing the people who developed oral traditions as historians, you know, even if they don't conform to what we consider professional historians or what the university considers. And I think that's an important first step. And once you take that first step, I think it becomes less difficult to engage in new forms of storytelling and history telling. So, you know, there's this division between professional history and, I suppose, ethno-history, and I'm all for kind of collapsing that a little bit, you know.
Thank you for the talk. In your discussion, you alluded to how this history is in some way universal, but also very local. And a priori, these seem to be in opposition.
What seemed to be in opposition?
The localism and the universalism. How do you see those two coming together?
That's a very interesting question. When I was talking about a universal history, I was talking about a history that could be told by many people as opposed to telling the history of your lineage or your family, right? I encountered that family history when I first came, right, with that story of Ngāti. But then I found more universal histories that were told by many people. The mechanism that engages the local with the universal in all of these stories is a marriage. You know, there's always this. Sometimes it's a complete subordination of a woman by a man, which is the case of Kazembe, but there's always this traveling man, and then in these stories, the woman is local or cedes authority to a certain extent. I think there are many ways of interpreting that, but that's the way in which Central Africans have articulated the difference between local and sort of more universal in a very gendered way. Yeah. Yeah.
The microphone. I was gonna take this one so that people on that side, Astrid, I'm looking at you, can ask their questions. So I did my labor. So bye.
I don't know if I quite. Okay.
Thank you, David. That was wonderful. Given that you want to try and open up different methods for telling
Right.
history, can you tell us a little bit more about the kinds of sources? I'm almost afraid to call them sources. What do you go to tell this perhaps more local, perhaps more original version of the past?
Well, the toolkit is threefold. One is collecting oral histories, right? That's very difficult for the stories I'm telling for the reasons I told you. But you first have to learn how those histories are told, so you need to have done that to understand how they are told. The second are archival sources. Now, we think in terms of a colonial archive of Europeans who write just what Europeans are interested in. When you get into the archives, they're a lot messier than that, thankfully. Because in that messiness, you get a lot of different voices, and you get a lot of people who are deeply interested in these stories, and when you read closely enough, you get oral traditions coming through archival sources, and that's what I've spent a lot of time doing over the last few years. It's painstaking work, actually. And my eyesight is none the better for it. And then there is objects, works of art that can be interpreted and read like I was doing in answer to Steve. So I've used all three. Works of art come with their own problems, in part because these works of art were taken by Europeans and Americans and valued as art, not as sources. There was various reasons to destroy their provenance, where they came from and when. And there still are reasons to disguise that provenance. And without that provenance, it's very difficult to use them as source. So that's what I've been doing, using those three. My time of actually interviewing in the field, it's not a fruitful endeavor for me at this point with these stories that I'm telling. But I would not be able to understand these stories without having done it previously, So yeah. Thank you.
Just briefly,
Charles.
Professor Gordon, great lecture. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
As one of your current students, I bask in any chance where I get to ask you questions.
But you never do it in class.
Especially after taking your midterm today. As you recall, just a couple months ago, Professor Dada was up on that
Right.
Stage talking a little bit about art in histories of Portuguese colonial regimes. And so I wanted to ask you how you saw in Central Africa the same kind of forms of trauma in art.
Wow, that is a difficult question. I'm not sure I can answer it with respect to this story here, but I'm going to do it with respect to another, which I hope will be my next book. Sorry, the one after this. The Portuguese in the late 19th century killed a king in Mozambique. Well, no, sorry, they didn't kill him. They captured him and they exiled him to the Azores, close by here. In the Azores, he wove a beautiful basket which is now in the Portuguese Ethnographic Museum. It's the most careful little miniature basket that he wove to give to his doctor. In that object, as I first saw it, I witnessed the tragedy of the loss of sovereignty and the complete collapse of the grandeur of this man into this delicately carved basket. So stories, when placed alongside objects, I think can tell a great deal about trauma, you know. So I don't know if that's it's not always evident in the object or in the work of art itself. It's when you place them in certain contexts. Yeah. So, Liet, I am ecstatic that the first people up are my students. It's really a great honor. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I guess I'm wondering, this is kind of this might be a broad question, but I'm hearing the way that you're talking about different ways of telling history, and I'm moved by it because although you're kind of talking about braiding and like universalizing, it feels like ultimately it's decentralizing. And so I guess it's like, what's at stake for the academy? Like, what are we doing?
Right. Yeah.
Because I'm all like, that's kind of what excites me. And I think that speaks to the, just, distinctions between what, public history and like academic history, and like, doing away with those things and recognizing sources as historians or historians as sources, all these different things. I guess I'm intrigued just to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, one of the most difficult things writing this talk was making the distinction between the appropriation of someone else's history and using someone else's history to destabilize what history is for us. And I'm not sure if I quite got there, because when I read through a few drafts of this, it was like, I'm sounding like I'm colonizing their history, So, but I think you put it perfectly. I mean, what I'm trying to do is say that there are ways of history telling new ways of history telling that can decenter traditional narratives, or our traditional narratives, put it that way, that can reorient the way our discipline history works, and the relationship between disciplines, and the relationship between professional historians and public historians. And that is what has become most exciting to me in the age of a professor. You spend a lot of time before you're a professor, like trying to please the academy and the hierarchy. But right now, I'm most excited about kind of breaking it down a little bit.
It sounds very cool. I think there's also a lot at stake in like how this complicates like national origin myth and like the nationalism and the internationalism, like how these kind of, your relationship to your history and the self is now suddenly kind of flipped and decentered and thrown around. It's cool.
Yeah,
I see the vision.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. That's really a great way of thinking about it. Well, I think it's late. And thank you very much, everyone, for attending.